Hello, today we're interviewing Chris Bosse from Lava Architecture.
Thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to be in Guatemala for the first time in my life. And I spent 24 hours in the city and I like it.
How do you translate nature to the expression in structure?
People always ask about our vision in architecture. And I always like to talk about the ideas of nature and technology. And the concept behind that is that the idea of nature is millions of years old. And it's kind of a universal truth that nature holds about how all things go together in life. And the idea of technology is that technology is something also very old, but also very new, something that continuously changes and constantly adapts. So when you think about the principle of how a tree grows, a tree has grown for millions of years in the same way. But when you think about the way how we communicate, how we interact, how we exchange information, how we build, how we plan, that constantly changes. And so we think in order to create an architecture that is always contemporary, if you combine these ancient principles of nature with the latest technology, then you have a chance to create something that is up to date and contemporary and future open. Today, we believe that with new technologies, new computational technologies, parametric design, algorithmic design, we can translate these ideas of nature more accurately and much more universally into contemporary structures. So if we study now how a coral reef functions, we can analyze it and analyze the growth and the systems behind the coral reef and translate those similar growth structures, for example, into the growth of a city, how a city grows. So one way is to plan a city on a piece of paper with a grid and with numbers and kind of with human perception of how a city should be. But the other thing is to try to program a city and base it on natural principles and try to predict growth of a city and allow for growth of a city.
I want to ask you, when and how did you start to do architecture with organic forms?
I think the interest in organic architecture comes probably from studying with the Institute for Lightweight Structures in Stuttgart, where Frei Otto was kind of researching structures and behavior in nature and translating that into architecture. And I've always been attracted, I think, to organic environments. And maybe that's just a personal thing, you know, I'm not very attracted to a square box. I'm attracted to something that flows and morphs and meanders. And so in all our projects, we're trying to achieve this kind of nature-like environment and feeling. So when you're in a building, it doesn't feel like you're in a dark room without windows, but you have light, you have air, you have movement, and you have a connection to the outside. And so I'm also very attracted to spaces that continuously change as you move through them. So experiences, essentially. You know, if you enter a black box, it's kind of you enter and you see everything or you see nothing, but the whole thing reveals itself in one vision. And if you walk through a forest, the air, the smell, the atmosphere continuously changes. So it would be beautiful walking through a city to have that same feeling of walking through a forest or swimming through a coral reef. And that goes for a city, but it also goes for a building. Building unravels itself as you move through it.
How would you describe and compare working for private clients versus governmental entities? Who have you seen allows more liberty or is willing to push the envelope in search of architectural innovation?
I think the question about who is your client is an important question in the first place. If you are your own client as an architect, that's a very interesting way of doing architecture because you are ultimately responsible for the building, but also for the finance, for the structure, for the construction, and for the sales, if it's a property that will be sold, or for the lease, etc., for the lifetime of a building, if you are your own client. Most of the times, someone else is your client, and you need to ask yourself, what are the motivations of this client? is the client, does he want to quickly sell your product? So build it cheap and sell it expensively? Is he someone who wants to make a contribution to society, to a social kind of system? Is he someone that wants to become famous for himself? He wants to build, an iconic tower for himself as a symbol for his company or himself? Or is it a government? And for the government, it's the same question. Is this a government scheme for social housing to create housing for underprivileged people at a low cost? Is it a scheme, say, like the Sydney Opera House, where you want to create a cultural institution, but at the same time, you want to create an iconic symbol for the city? And when you look at the Sydney Opera House, it's a very good example for how one building can single-handedly shape the image of a city. When you think about Sydney, it's the first thing you think of, and it's probably the most well-known building around the world. It was also one of the most expensive buildings around the world and one of the longest and most complicated construction processes. But as a result, it has become this super successful project. From the projects that we are currently working on, or that we have worked on over the last 10 or so years, working with governments in the Western world is a very lengthy process. There's a lot of stakeholders. There's governmental stakeholders, financial stakeholders, political stakeholders, cultural stakeholders, considerations like heritage, traffic. There's a million people involved in any project. And that's good. The advantage is that the project is very thoroughly researched and planned and executed. The disadvantage is that the more people involved, the more complicated, the more lengthy, and the more compromised quite often. But generally, the projects are for the greater benefit of the public, publicly accessible, and a contribution to the city. That's generally the idea. When you have private clients, then usually the idea is buy a piece of land, build a lot of apartments, offices, etc. It has to be commercially viable. And the good thing about that is, because the client is under a lot of pressure financially, it also has to happen quickly. Because if you hold a piece of land for 10 years and you can't build anything on it, and essentially you lose the ability to build on that land profitably. So the advantage is it goes in many ways quicker and easier, but on the other hand, it's much more compromised by economical factors. So there's advantages and disadvantages to both sides. Governments in other countries such as China and the Middle East often have a much more top-down, say, approval process. So quite often the projects get planned and executed much quicker. So you can accomplish the same amount of building that in Australia would take 10, 20 years. You can accomplish within 2-3 years in China. The concern about those kind of projects sometimes can be that environmental concerns, for example, are less considered if they're not on the agenda of that particular developer.
What do you believe were fundamental changes in your architectural vision?
So generally, the idea of Lava is that we are a network practice. Network practice means it doesn't rely so much on a single architect to be the God-given master of architecture, say like Frank Lloyd Wright, but it's more a network of individuals with different types of talents that can be applied to different projects in multiple ways. And so when we started Lava in Sydney in 2007, at the same time we opened an office in Berlin and in Stuttgart, and at the time we had a branch in Dubai in the Middle East. And now we have an office in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. And so each of these offices is kind of a think tank by itself, but it's also part of the network to work globally on ideas, on projects, on technologies, on knowledge. And so I like to think of it as kind of, we call it the Lava universe. And so it's not about individuals, it's not about me, it's not about my partner Tobias Walliser and Alexander Rieck. It's more about us as a group attracting young, talented architects, interesting international clients, and trying to together to apply our knowledge to projects around the world. So my vision is not to become the greatest architecture firm or the biggest architecture firm of all times, or to become the greatest architect of all times. My vision would rather be that we accumulate knowledge and disseminate knowledge around the globe within and beyond our network.
Well, thank you, Chris. Thank you for your time and answering our questions. Hopefully everybody that listens to this will find it enriching.